North America's exploration by Europeans was trapping the beavers. So we got rid of the beavers, and then we started, building houses and needing wood for fuel. And so we started cutting down the trees. And, back then we didn't have, sediment and erosion control on the hill slopes, so we started sending all that sediment down into our valleys. We also channelized the valleys, channelized the streams to create, drier floodplains that were easier to farm. And so all that sediment from the hilltops started building up sediment in our valleys. And again, I totally acknowledge you all are well aware of this. But just want you to know that, these legacy impacts are not lost on me. They're front and center. And so you took a landscape that had, multi-threaded streams that had really good connectivity with the floodplain and lots of off-channel habitats for fish and other critters to use outside of the channel. And we systematically made our watersheds more efficient. We've made our floodplains less connected to the streams to make them drier for agriculture, better drained. And then, what many of us work on today is kind of the urban suburban landscape. That's where a lot of our, resources are in terms of the stormwater field. A lot of development on the East Coast, as you all aware. And, we've really made our hydrologic network super efficient at shedding the water from the landscape and routing it very quickly to the streams. And so all of that has kind of tipped the scales into more energy in the streams, trapped in these entrenched settings, and more enlargement and more erosion. Thinking about it a little differently in terms of Lane's balance, Lane had the dominant forces of erosion, discharge, and slope on the one side, and dominant resistance of sediment supply, sediment size on the other side. But you could expand that and think about anything that either contributes to resistance, like beavers or grade control or bank strength or vegetation, and things that contribute to energy, like how deep the channel is, or how deep the water is on the floodplain and the valley slope and so on. But we've pretty much systematically tipped the scales towards erosion and away from resistance. So urbanization, deforestation, beaver extirpation, lots larger flows. Channelization makes our slopes steeper, our bankfill depths deeper, and therefore more erosion. And then removing the wood is less resistance. Floodplain encroachment on top of the legacy sediments from deforestation is even more disconnection between the floodplain and the channel. And so and then riparian removal, lots of folks kind of mow into the edge of the bank and so forth. So we've done a really good job of tipping the scales towards erosion and away from resistance. And so particularly in the urban suburban context, I ask this question a lot. You don't have to answer it now if you don't want to, but I always ask this, when I'm talking about urbanization of streams. It's like, how many of you know or work in a suburban watershed without any impairments or any impaired streams? And usually the answer is no one. Maybe there's like a few snippets of examples where they're seeing some recovery. But these data are from Northern Kentucky, but it's a similar story across any comparable data set across the globe. Is that you measure biotic integrity. This is EPT richness, so the mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, how many taxa or how many of those species there are in a system. And we see that above 3% impervious area in the watershed, we get a pretty big drop off, and then above 10% impervious area, it kind of flatlines at a pretty minuscule number of species. So again, Northern Kentucky data, but same story across the globe in any sort of long-term data set or data set of with any sort of gradient like that as far as urbanization. So I'm going to just share a brief history of stormwater management and development in Northern Kentucky. That's the data, that's the region I have the most data on, but it's a very good example of the story nationally. Allison Roy and colleagues did a really nice summary of kind of the trajectory of stormwater management as it was in 2008. And this tracks pretty well with that. So this is an aerial in 1985 in northern Kentucky. And back then in 1985, the stormwater policy was simply convey it away. So, you have your rooftops, your parking lots, your roads, all creating more runoff. And the name of the game was just get it away from our developed areas, get it as routed as quickly as possible to a nearby stream. And so that inherently, all that extra runoff and very efficient routing makes the peak much larger. All right, so no surprise, any engineer can tell you that that's going to cause some flooding. Not even engineer would. That's just a no-brainer. It's going to cause flooding, and so once engineers and policymakers saw all that extra flooding, they said that's bad. So engineers put their flood control hats on, and we said, all right, starting around the 90s or so. This is an aerial from 1995. So, you can kind of compare, you see the development expanding, right, between those two 10-year aerials. But anyway, 1995, or, mid 90s or whatever, it varied from city to city, but in the 90s, thereabouts, some places it was even earlier, but we started doing conventional detention, where what you try to do is you have your pre-developed hydrograph here, and you have your post-developed runoff, so a lot more runoff created from our parking lots and our rooftops. And we route that into a detention basin like this one. And then we design the outlet so that, for a 2-year storm like this one or a 100-year storm, you don't let the outlet exceed the pre-development peak discharge. So you see that, you've got more runoff, and you're prolonging that duration, but in general, you're trying to keep that peak below the pre-development peak discharge. So that was the solution for flood control. But if you look at any given detention basin, even when it's raining, there's never any water in them, because these were typically designed for the very large events. Usually the smallest event they would attenuate is like the 2-year event. And the 2-year event is larger than 99% of the storms in a typical year. So, any given rain event, you're just not going to see much water in these detention basins. Another thing that we realized with all this expanding development was that, especially without erosion and sediment control on these development sites, we end up with milkshake water. And so we needed, construction site runoff controls, and we needed, kind of water quality controls in our stormwater control measures to intercept some of those pollutants, bird dew, dog dew, road salts, so on and so forth. Try to knock those pollutants out of the stormwater, out of the water column, and prevent it from polluting our streams. And so in the 2000s, this is an aerial from 2005. So again, I'm just going to flip backwards just so you can see the difference. So you see the development continues to march out away from the original areas. I forgot to mention, this is Cincinnati, Ohio, kind of downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, and its urban area. And then this is northern Kentucky's original, cities right across the river from Cincinnati. And then these are kind of the sprawl, like most of America. And then this is the airport that serves Cincinnati and the northern Kentucky region. So you can kind of see that development's continuing to expand. Sometime in the 2000s, many communities started implementing the water quality controls, where instead of just a conventional detention basin, you might have a bioinfiltration basin, you might have an extended detention basin. But in general, what I thought was a pretty reasonable approach was, you take a rainfall event that captures, say, 80 to 90% of the rainfall events in a typical year, and you make sure that volume gets routed into some sort of water quality feature that either infiltrates or filters that runoff before letting it discharge. So that has done by many accounts, a pretty good job of improving the quality of stormwater runoff, leaving our stormwater control measures. But you also see that, above that water quality volume. And then, you've got this kind of no man's land here before you get to the regional flood protection, which typically is about the 2-year discharge. So in Northern Kentucky, that's 3 inches or so. I imagine it's probably a little bit higher in Maryland and Virginia. You're closer to the coast. But anyway, that's when your flood control is kicking in. And what we started noticing, even downstream of these newer developments that had these water quality controls, we were still seeing stream erosion. And so not just in Northern Kentucky, but in across the world, really, stormwater control measures were not sufficiently restricting erosive flows. And that's because of this discharge threshold we call the critical discharge for stream erosion. This is an adapted figure from Brian Bledsoe, my old advisor, from a 2002 paper. But if you consider this conventional peak matching design, and you consider the time, the amount of flow, the magnitude and duration of flow above that magic critical discharge, and you kind of compare it to the pre-developed. So if you compare the no detention to the pre-developed, it's about 3 times as much erosion potential as the pre-developed condition. But our conventional peak matching detention is also about 2 to 3 times as much erosion potential as the pre-developed condition. And so, what we're seeing is that, even with these peak matching controls and our water quality controls, we're still seeing more erosion than the pre-developed condition. But that does not have to be the case. So, I'm a civil engineer with a PhD specialization in river mechanics, pretty much adjacent to geomorphology. But folks have been studying this for 90 years, even 100 years, if you go back to Shields' predecessors. But we really know stream erosion. This is a lab from, these are screenshots from the University of Minnesota Stream Lab. If you keep your eye on this rock right here, you start to see, another 14 seconds in, it starts to mobilize. So it starts to roll a little bit, and then it continues to roll a little bit. And then in the next frame, it's entrained, it's fully entrained, and it's gone. It's gone, after that. And so, we know, in this lab, they know the exact pebble size, they know the exact sand content, they know the exact flow rate. They even calculate things like hiding factors and how much the grain is sticking out into the water column versus like kind of being embedded in an armor layer. There's so much knowledge on stream erosion. And so where we have spent a lot of our time as a consulting as a consulting company is trying to convey this message of the critical discharge for stream bed erosion being the mechanistic link between hydrology, so stormwater management basically, and stream erosion and biological integrity. And we've been collaborating with a lot of researchers. These are data from California, where I collected my PhD data, Kentucky, and Victoria, Australia. And we showed that, when you standardize the critical discharge for stream erosion, you standardize it by the 2-year undeveloped peak discharge so that you can kind of compare them across different watersheds. And you standardize them, we call it the standardized critical discharge, and you compare it to the grain size. It's no surprise that the larger the grain size, the more resistant that stream bed is to erosion. And so if you've got a stream bed that's mostly in the cobble range, your critical discharge is probably something like 40, 50%, even 100% of the 2-year discharge. Whereas if you're in the kind of the mid-range of gravels, your critical discharge might be between like 1% and 10% of the 2-year discharge. But needless to say, we've got lots of data on what the critical discharge is for different size ranges. and how to actually measure it in your own backyard, in your own region. We've got some pretty simple methods for kind of measuring and calibrating to any given region. But it's really again the missing link, or the mechanistic link between stormwater management and stream erosion. And not just me, but many researchers. This is Ellie up in Canada. She's measuring stream bed particle displacement rates with fancy tracers embedded in these pebbles, and she's seeing accelerated rates in mobilization. And so you can imagine you mobilize some of the bed material, and not all those particles get replaced by particles from upstream. Well, you do that over and over and over. What happens is, your bed is going to get deeper because you just moved the rocks that were on the bottom of it, so it just got deeper, right? So what we're seeing is these incision-based trajectories, these degradational trajectories, often revolving around hard points like culverts or exposed bedrock, where the farther upstream you are from a hard point, the more incision you have as those head cuts migrate farther and farther upstream. And so, that's leading to these channel evolution trajectories. This one is from Shum and others. We call it the classic channel evolution model, where you begin by mobilizing too many of the bed particles, and then you make your stream deeper, right? Well, as the stream gets deeper, the banks get taller and become more unstable, and they start to fall in, and then that leads to widening, right? And then eventually the stream banks get so wide that the stream can't transport the particles that are coming off the banks, and so you lead to aggradation. Interestingly, though, this is the stage where you see the fastest widening rates, because these bars end up deflecting flow into vertical banks that are already geotechnically unstable. So you end up having to get even a lot wider than this before you start to actually redevelop these benches and start to get vegetation to colonize these bars and develop benches and sort of reattain an equilibrium. So Shum first observed this in their arroyos out west, but also in laboratory experiments. And then, many researchers have seen similar trajectories across the eastern U.S., including in the Piedmont. And so, these degradational trajectories, the key here is you can't start them unless you're mobilizing that bed material, right? And so that critical discharge really is important to trying to prevent some of these, pretty consequential geomorphic trajectories of instability. And then, for the bugs that live on the bottom of the rocks, it's basically a lethal disturbance to a lot of these species when their home becomes mobilized and entrained like that. They can be crushed, they can be killed kind of in the sediment transport process. Even the ones that have really tough shells, like caddisflies, they might survive, but they've kind of lost their home and kind of have to start over. So it's a major biological disturbance, often lethal. And so the more frequently you're mobilizing the bed, the more frequently you're starting these incision-based trajectories, the more frequently you're disturbing these bugs, and that's not giving them enough time to complete their life cycle according to kind of their evolutionary what they were evolved to handle. And so here's some data from a Northern Kentucky site with in a watershed that drains 30% impervious area. This site, we saw 14 bed mobilizing events in less than 1 year. And just for reference, in Northern Kentucky, our reference sites typically have 1 to 2 bed mobilizing events per year. So if you were a bug that was evolved to complete your life cycle in maybe 1 year or 6 months, you could probably handle this 1 to 2 bed mobilizing events per year. But you mobilize the bed 14 times in less than a year, those bugs have no chances. And And then we had 5 events larger than the USGS 2-year peak discharge, 1,650 CFS in this system. So everything from just barely above the 2-year discharge to almost twice as much as the 2-year discharge. And here's an example of one event that was 33% larger than the 2-year discharge. It moved our 300 millimeter tracer particles, so about a 50 to 100 pound particle. It moved to 81 meters downstream. And in this system, 300 millimeters is the 95th percentile particle. So that's really telling you that there are very little stable particles left for those bugs to hold on and sort of recolonize the habitat after the disturbance event. So that's just kind of the context here of what it means for those bugs. And then that was kind of all somewhat focused on the conventional detention, but what about green infrastructure? I thought green infrastructure is supposed to protect fish and macroinvertebrates from erosion. Well, I'm going to lean on Bree Williams and Chrissy Hopkins and a lot of the folks at USGS who've been monitoring these experimental watersheds in Maryland for about 20 years. And this is one of the best data sets we have in the world, really. And so they've got, and I'm sorry if you already know this study well, but it's such a great study. It's worth showing. So they've got a forested watershed that serves as a control. They've got an agricultural watershed that also serves as a control. And they've got 2 treatment watersheds. These treatment watersheds had effectively 100% of their new impervious area routed through green infrastructure. And they've got all kinds of data downstream of them, including repeat channel surveys in the streams. And so this is an example of one of their sites in treatment 1, where here's the channel in 2004, here's the channel in 2017. You see the channel got deeper, it got wider, so it got larger, right? So you would call this channel evolution model stage 3. So it's getting deeper and wider, and you're not seeing aggradation, right? And Bree Williams and her co-authors went through and categorized all of the the survey data to sort of summarize them. And in the forested watershed, what they measured predominantly was stage 5, so the recovered condition where you've got vegetated benches and relative stability of the channel, and in some cases recovering, so stage 4, where you've got aggradation but not quite stable benches yet. In the agricultural watershed, the dominant condition was this stage 4 recovering, so it's widening, but it's a grading, right? So you're getting these bars forming, but they're not quite recovered to fully vegetated benches yet. And there were a couple sites that had degradational stage 2 and stage 3 condition in this agricultural watershed. And then these treatment watersheds with the high density of green infrastructure, what they measured was that it was mostly in these degradational stages of stage 2 and stage 3. So kind of downcutting or downcutting and bank failure. So downcutting and widening, right? And not as much. There were some some cross sections that were in this stage 4 recovering or aggradational, and then there was one instance that kind of showed a stable or recovered stage 5. So it's not to say that these treatments aren't helping. I'm not an author on this study, but if I'm just as an observer, it seems like they're showing a benefit. But if you look at the hydrograph, the hydrologic data, this is from a Chrissy Hopkins paper. What she's showing is that if you look at the peak flows and you compare the peak flows post development to pre-development for the same event precipitation depth, you see almost an order of magnitude higher peak flow, and you also see similar story with duration. So you know, longer durations of flows, larger runoff yields, and you know, higher runoff ratios. And so that right there explains what we were saying earlier, that, you know, if you're not restricting those erosive flows, you know, it doesn't matter how much water you're routing through green infrastructure, if we're still having higher peak flows and longer durations of those peak flows than the pre-developed condition, we're going to cause more erosion, and that explains those degradational trajectories that we measured back on the previous slide. So, but again, this is not new, even to kind of the general civil engineering community. This is our manual of practice, way back from 1992. American Society of Civil Engineers and the Water Environment Federation noted that, you know, if natural channels were going to be used for carrying stormwater runoff, it will result in erosion unless those that increased runoff was adequately managed with properly designed detention basins. And so, you know, we've known this would be a problem since '92, and, you know, yet somehow our stormwater management policies have missed this critical piece to prevent that excess erosion. We're seeing erosion rates, measured erosion rates in developed streams in northern Kentucky that are 10 times higher than our undeveloped sites. And then, you know, many researchers have known this for a long time. This is a paper from the Piedmont that basically stream bank erosion is the dominant source of sediment and nutrients. So, you know, I know Chesapeake Bay, you again probably already know this, but, you know, you're not stopping the nutrient loads to the bay unless you're, you know, slowing down that stream bank erosion, which contains a lot of those nutrient loads. In northern Kentucky, some of our water quality data coupled with our stream bank erosion rates. So you see our highest sediment. These are standardized loads based on a benchmark. So, you know, whatever the load is divided by the benchmark, that's what these ratios are. In our developed sites, we're seeing the highest sediment and bacteria. That's no surprise. But then if you compare what we're seeing in the water column to what we're measuring in terms of erosion rates in the banks, and you extrapolate that, you know, pounds per square mile per year of bank erosion to the watershed, and you compare it to the water column, you can basically explain over 100% of the load we're seeing in the water column by the stream bank erosion we're measuring and seeing in our streams. So again, no surprise. City of Austin, Texas is one of our clients, and they had a report way back in 1990 that, you know, based on the water quality data they were measuring, where they could deduce that, you know, 90% of the TSS loads in Austin streams were projected from stream erosion. So it you know, yet most of the energy on the stormwater management world has been focused on designing stormwater control measures like green infrastructure to intercept sediment out of the water column. So to take the loads that go into those basins and try to get sediment filtered out of them before they discharge into the streams. Well, no matter how good of a job that does at taking the sediment out of the runoff coming to the site, if we're releasing erosive flows downstream of the site, the erosion that we're causing the stream, that's 90% plus of the load of the TSS load. So we're kind of missing the target if we're focused on sediment, right? If we're focused on sediment, we really need to be focusing on the flows that leave the site and how fast and how the magnitude and the duration that they leave these features. So again, Austin, City of Austin, you know, known as a pretty progressive town. Their water quality manual is pretty intense. We've done a lot of designs down there, and it is an involved process, but they are not preventing these kind of degradational trajectories, you know, exposing infrastructure, risks of private property, you know, all kinds of infrastructure impacts, culvert impacts, and so forth. because we've overlooked this critical discharge, in our stormwater management. So, so anyway, that's kind of the stormwater side of it. But just for the, so again, water quality controls, very important. Knock those pollutants out of the water column. Flood control is obviously important, but if we're not managing and restricting the flows that leave the site to limit erosion, we're going to cause erosion, excess erosion in our streams. And then the last piece of this is the biological piece, which is the importance of critical discharge is even evident at our reference sites. So this was a study from 2016 at one of Northern Kentucky's best reference sites, or least disturbed sites, best attainable condition site, whatever you want to call it. This is what it typically looks like. Vegetated benches, nice canopy, really nice looking stream. The bugs at Middle Creek, these are Middle Creek data, and these are all of the Northern Kentucky data just for reference. And so these are all the Northern Kentucky data by kind of categorized by impervious area. Middle Creek is less than 3% impervious area, so it's one of our reference sites. And you can see any given year, Middle Creek might kind of be higher or lower for MBI, or might be higher or lower for taxa richness, higher or lower for EPT richness. But what we noticed was in 2011, it was exceptionally bad. And what we were able to deduce was that bug data was collected 25 days after an event that was about 2 times larger than the critical discharge. And we so happen to have repeat cross-section data at that site. And you compared 2010, the dashed line here, channel surface, to 2011, the orange line here. We saw, I don't know, something like 25–50% channel enlargement that year, right? Because of that, pretty massive event. I think it was a 40-year storm, for reference. But then, so our bugs dipped that year. They got as bad as basically, our sites with 20 to 30% impervious area, as far as the bug community goes. But because it's a forested watershed, predominantly forested, very little development, over time, that channel was able to recover. So here's the 2011 surface, 2012, 13, 14, right? So by 2014, 3 years after that big event, this channel size is about the same size as the 2010 channel size as far as the bankful area. And so, that's really the definition of geomorphic equilibrium and kind of resiliency. You're not over time getting a lot larger or smaller. You're basically keeping about the same size over time. And so we call that, an equilibrium site geomorphically. And guess what? That serves as our, biological reference. And we see here, any given year, the days since a disturbance event. So the more recovery time we give our biological sample, the better the biotic integrity. So our MBI tends to be really good if we've got at least 200 to 300 days of stability prior to the sample. Whereas if we have, less than 200 days or so, we'd have lower MBI. And then if we've got just 20 days, we're really in the crapper. So that's our reference site. But then, the same story applies to the full gradient of urbanization. And so this is kind of what ties it all together as far as reduced Q critical disturbance can improve MBI across all of our sites, not just our reference sites. So in 2009 and 2014, they were exceptionally low disturbance years. And we had some of our developed watersheds out here had MBIs that were just as good or even better than our reference sites, because the that was a year when the rain just wasn't that intense, right? And then 2010, 2013, kind of similar story. So again, these were basically years with 200 plus days of stability at our reference sites, and our urban sites were doing pretty good. 2007, 2008, that's really one of the most insightful pieces of data, because in 2008, at our reference site at Middle Creek, we had 206 days since a Q critical event. So again, 200 days of stability, pretty good MBI at our reference site. But just 60 days prior to the 2008 sample at Middle Creek, an event almost exceeded Q critical at our reference site at Middle Creek. So you can pretty much guarantee that if it almost exceeded Q critical at our reference site, it definitely exceeded Q critical at our developed sites. And that's why this linear regression is so much steeper in these in 2008, 2007. So our developed sites are much lower, because basically 60 days before their sample they got hammered, right? Whereas Middle Creek, it was just below that critical discharge. And then 2011, the year I kind of highlighted for Middle Creek, that was a 40-year event, so it basically hammered all of our sites across the board. I think this reference site sample was probably before the disturbance event, which is why it's kind of the outlier there. But in general, all of our sites were hammered, and so the whole curve was offset, about 30 points lower on average. So you kind of get the idea here. If we, the 40-year event is always going to disturb everything. So we're going to have bad bugs no matter what. But those events that just barely exceed Q critical at our urban sites, if they could be restricted enough to not exceed Q critical, we'd have data, we'd have bug data that was more like our reference sites, right? Like we saw in these years of data, right? And so anyway, we took that as kind of the last piece of evidence that Q critical really is important, this missing link between stormwater and geomorphology and biology. But as this figure shows, you get a nice relationship, but this is like 2 orders of magnitude of scatter. So it really needs to be calibrated to your stream or region. And again, we've got papers on how to do that and methods on how to do that. But this is kind of the takeaway message of the day. It's not rocket surgery. To protect streams from erosion, we need to design our stormwater infrastructure to restrict erosive flows. It's really that simple. And Q critical is that kind of magic target that helps us restrict erosive flows. Okay, so this is the paper from Watershed Science Bulletin that I worked with Lisa on way back in 2012 and getting this study published. But this is one way to look at what we mean by Q critical being the safe release target. So in this system, Q critical is 20 CFS. This is these are flow magnitude divided up into different histogram bins, 10 CFS histogram bins. And then this is the cumulative duration over a 50-year simulation. And so you see under kind of the post-developed condition without restricting Q critical, all of the extra runoff is creating much higher peak flows, just like Chrissy Hopkins measured in the Maryland study, and much longer durations. So at 65 CFS, instead of 0.1 or 0.2 hours over a 50-year simulation, we're closer to like 9 or 10 hours, right? That's a lot more erosive power on the cumulative, right? And you do that at every single one of these, right? That ends up explaining why we've got so much more eroded and degraded streams downstream of this type of flow regime. Well, the Q critical target basically says, let's take all that extra runoff and release it below Q critical, right? So I'm going to flip backwards. So you see all this extra runoff doesn't go away. We just route it to a detention basin or extended detention basin, and we prolong the durations of flows that don't cause erosion, because a lot of you might work in, watersheds that have clay soils or clay subsoils, and you can't really infiltrate it. Even if you can infiltrate it, it's a tough thing to do in a lot of areas. So you got that extra runoff, rather than just letting it rip, we just make sure we're releasing it below that critical discharge. And that's going to basically say, so we're not saying we never exceed Q critical. So the green, we still have, close to an hour of flows that at the 45 CFS magnitude, but it's not longer than it was under pre-developed condition. So 38 CFS, we had about an hour under pre-developed condition. Now we have about, 0.3, 0.5 hours. So you see these green bars are less than the blue bars as far as duration goes for these flows that exceed Q critical. And then all the ones that exceed the blue bars are less than Q critical. So we're prolonging those flows in a way that does not contribute to extra erosion. This actually, that figure was from 2012, but the idea of that figure, the framework from that figure, dates back to 2002 from a paper by Brian Bledsoe, and he called it the erosion potential. He termed the term erosion potential, the symbol E here, and the basic idea is, you don't just look at one storm, you actually look at all the storms over a continuous simulation, or maybe all the design storms, and you make sure that the time integrated erosive power of all the discharges under the post-developed regime is less than the time integrated erosive power of all the discharges under the pre-developed regime. And so that results in this E of less than 1. Long way of saying it's just the math behind the idea of let's not let our post-development stormwater flows cause more erosion than our pre-development. And communities that are using this approach are preventing stream erosion and promoting geomorphic recovery. California's been requiring this since, roughly the mid 20-teens or 2010s or whatever. And they're seeing recovering trajectories in their repeat surveys downstream of new development. In Kentucky, we're seeing recovering trajectories in some of our watersheds that we've done retrofits of conventional stormwater basins upstream. But in Victoria, Australia, they've been doing lots and lots of, green infrastructure kind of retroactively in some of these older developments. And, they're intercepting a lot of runoff. They're getting it routed to a lot of cisterns and water reuse facilities. But the problem is that it was not targeted and optimized for that critical discharge for the receiving streams. And so they're still seeing degradation in their channels. So, they know about the E approach, the erosion potential approach. They're working towards E less than 1 approach, but to date, they hadn't tailored their stormwater retrofits to that threshold. So they're not seeing the results that they'd like to. There's a range of implementation options for this. Southern California kind of uses an integration, basically makes developers or designers run sediment transport capacity for all the design storms. In Northern Kentucky and Austin, Texas, we're making it a lot easier on the developers and the engineers. We're saying, rather than giving designers, pretty cumbersome requirement of running sediment transport modeling for a lot of design storms, we did all that on the front end, and we figured out that in Northern Kentucky, all we need to do is require that the 2-year post-development peak discharge is less than Q critical, and in Austin, it's the 2-month post-development peak discharge less than Q critical, and I'll get into the reasons why there. But we just recently published this approach. It's up on the web. I think it's coming out in December. But we've got this, again, kind of keep it simple, stupid strategy of it's probably not like the perfect approach everywhere, but it's a whole lot better than what we're doing right now. And we've kind of demonstrated it in Northern Kentucky and Austin that you basically do everything you're already supposed to do with flood control and water quality criteria, and then we incorporate this Q critical erosion prevention with a single design storm. So we give them basically either we change one design target that they were already doing, or we give them one new storm to run, rather than trying to make it really hard and have them run sediment transport on, continuous simulation, for example. So this is how simple it was in Northern Kentucky. So we said, here's the design storm, and here's a comparison to the previous approach. So, we see all these things that say no change, right? No change on anything except the 2-year. The 2-year used to be, don't let the post-development peak exceed the pre-development peak. Now we're saying, don't let the post-development peak exceed more than 0.4 CFS per acre of drainage area for any site that drains 100 acres or less. So that basically that's how you scale Q critical in this setting. There's some exceptions if you've got a site that drains more than 100 acres, which is pretty rare. But in general, that's how simple it is in Northern Kentucky. And then just kind of comparison to Austin. Austin is finer bed material. It's more like 20 millimeters instead of 60. The Q critical in Austin is more like 2% of the 2-year discharge instead of about 45% of the 2-year discharge in Northern Kentucky. And so the design storm that we're restricting below Q critical in Northern Kentucky, it's the 2-year. In Austin, it's the 2-month. You do those things in those settings, and you meet flood control and you meet the existing water quality rules and regs. You get the aggregate of less than or equal to the erosive power of the pre-development regime. In short, no additional erosion compared to the pre-developed condition. So after we build this development, after we put this detention basin in, or extended detention, or whatever we put in, it shouldn't have any more erosive power than the pre-developed condition. Importantly, we worked really hard on this. Q critical does not require appreciably larger stormwater control measures compared to those that met conventional flood control and water quality criteria. So this is an example in Austin. So in Austin, they got pretty complex water quality rules and regs. So that a lot of times people do a separate water quality basin and then a conventional detention basin to kind of tackle their water quality and flood control rules and regs. And here's the change if you're meeting Q critical. So, compare that to that. It got basically less than 10% larger of a detention basin. And we went from 60% more erosive power than the pre-developed condition to 20% less erosive power than the pre-developed condition. So that's how simple it can be. I mean, this is the outlet structure. So, the water quality feature, we didn't have any changes to that. And then the detention feature, we had some changes to some of the windows, and we had basically a gravel protected underdrain with a restricted orifice of 6.4 centimeters for all the flows up to including the 2-month storm had to be routed out through this instead of this first window. And then you do that for the 2-month storm in Austin. You do all the water quality rules, all the flood control rules. In aggregate, you have less erosive power than the pre-developed condition. So getting back to the Northern Kentucky case study, in 2015, we implemented the Q critical policy. So here's one of our study sites that supported that recommendation. This was a stream site just downstream of the airport over here, downstream of a Toyota facility. And this is what it looked like before we did the retrofit of the basin. Here's what it looked like about 5 years after we did the retrofit of the basin to meet Q critical. You see the bench that's recovered. You see this tree that is right here. It's right here. Its roots are no longer exposed. We're seeing this geomorphic recovery in this system here. So then, led us to scaling it out, doing lots of retrofits of detention basins and then requiring it on all new development. Since 2015, we've got 10 years of this policy being implemented. We've got 3,000 acres of new impervious area since 2015. So 5 square miles of new impervious area in this Northern Kentucky setting, over 500 new developments. So just kind of compare 2015 to 2025, you see lots of continued sprawl, continued kind of infill along these highways. And so we got lots more development. We've also done numerous retrofits of conventional stormwater control measures. We've got 9 years of biological data before acute critical. We've got 9 years of biological data after acute critical. They're all these sites are sampled on kind of a rotating basis. And this is the rainfall, daily precipitation before and after. So it looks very similar, right? And if you kind of look at it in a histogram format, the more recent period actually has had the higher rainfall event, and that won't surprise many of you with kind of all the crazy weather we've been having all over the place. But if you look at like the events that exceed acute critical, so 50 millimeter rainfall typically exceeds acute critical to reference site. So that's right here. That's basically twice per year at both periods. So about 20 events. So we've had about 10 years pre, 10 years post, so about twice per year on average. That's some years probably 1, some years probably 3 or 4, but in general twice per year. Events that exceeded just 40 millimeters of rainfall, that's typically going to not exceed acute critical at a reference site, but typically would exceed acute critical at a conventional developed watershed. Very similar, slightly more exceedances per year in the recent policy period, and then 30 millimeters per year. You're not exceeding acute critical to reference site, but you're probably exceeding it in a heavily developed watershed. Again, a little bit more occurrences in the more recent period. So long way of saying, anything we're seeing in the bug data is not attributable to the rain not being as erosive as it was 9 years prior to the acute critical policy. And then we've got our reference sites, our best reference sites in Lower Kentucky, Middle Creek, which is the one I talked about earlier, and then Double Lick. Middle Creek's in red. This is every year. MBI, this is EPT, so the sensitive taxa. And you see they kind of bounce around, but really our reference sites aren't getting really any better or worse compared to the pre 2015 data. Same story here. There's kind of one period that was bad, 2011, which you knew about, and then 1 year that was kind of bad, exceptionally bad for Double Lick, not so bad for Middle Creek, but kind of the same story here for EPT, right? So our reference sites aren't really getting any better or worse. Our rain was not any better or worse for the most part. And here's all the bug data. And all the bug data plotted as MBI versus watershed impervious area. And this is EPT versus, total impervious area of the watershed. And the, post 2015 period, that's in blue. The pre-2015 period is in orange. And we see that our MBI on average for any given, watershed imperviousness, it's about 10-fold better, or not 10-fold, 10 points better on MBI on average. So, our watersheds with 30% impervious area, after the acute critical policy, they're about 10 MBI points on average better than our, pre-acute critical policy, and kind of similar story for 20% impervious area and going all the way back here. EPT, it's a similar story. It's about 2 or 3 species of more species present in the post-acute critical period than the pre-acute critical policy period, all across the entire board. So 30% impervious area, we're getting anywhere from 5 to 10 or even 11 EPT taxa at some of these sites, whereas before the average was less than 5 of these sensitive taxa of sensitive species. So you know, it's not done. The story's not over, but we are seeing sort of incremental progress in the biology. We're also seeing prolonged base flows downstream of these detention basins. Again, they have extra runoff volume. We're releasing that volume in a slow way that does not exceed Q critical. Well, that's expanding base flows to some of these streams that, thinking back to the pre-European settlement period, these streams used to be a lot wetter. They used to have a lot more beavers and inline wood that held flow longer. So all of that is kind of a benefit as far as the, aquatic bugs are concerned. And then we're seeing geomorphic recovery in these watersheds where we've got surfaces intercepted by these Q critical basins. Before we publish this, we got to do some spatial analysis to see, of the sites with like 30 or 20% impervious area that we're seeing these better bug scores, how much of that surface is effectively managed by these Q critical controls, so that we can kind of get an idea of, we know we probably can't retroactively get all the pavement managed through Q critical controls, but can we show improvements with just 25% of it effectively managed, or does it need to be 50%, for example? So we got to do some GIS work to kind of get some of those insights out, and then we really need to repeat the story in a different setting. So Northern Kentucky, it's already been implemented for 10 years. We've seen lots of good data there. Austin, Texas, they validated their Q critical, and they're in the early phases of policy implementation. I think they just implemented their rule change in this winter. And so, they're at the very, we've done some retrofits, kind of proof of concept retrofits of existing detention basins, but they're at the very early phases for requiring it on new development. That's kind of it on the Q critical stuff and the stream erosion stuff. But we do have a lot of resources out there on our website. We have this sustainable watershed planning guidebook that we put together for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. If you're interested, there's these kind of our 4 lowest cost strategies for restoring a more natural flow regime, a less erosive flow regime in sort of previously developed watersheds that lack Q critical control. So detention basin retrofits, I talked about those. They're kind of no-brainer because the water's already going to these, and trying to retrofit them with plates and things that are pretty simple. In floodplains where you've got space, you can't really develop them because they're going to flood, right? So we're doing these things called floodplain wetlands, where we're excavating that post-settlement alluvium and getting it out of the floodplain. That's providing a relief valve that's reducing flooding, and it's also reducing erosion and improving water quality in our waterways. So kind of dollar for dollar, that's one of the best kind of low-cost strategies, sort of on a floodplain scale. And then, some of our headwater reaches, we've been doing hand-placed log structures. Got a lot of pilot implementations of that, trying to get them ramped behind existing trees to kind of mimic the historic wood regime. And then, if you can do it, if you got property owners that are okay with it, kind of either beaver reintroductions or at least discontinued extirpation of beavers, that they letting them work their magic is by far the cheapest solution, as long as the landowners are okay with it. So that was kind of, those all were summarized in a recent paper on for ASCE. But and then this one about, Mark mentioned kind of thinking about stream restoration a little bit more outside the box. This was that paper that where I summarized kind of some of those ideas. It's a free one to download from Bioscience, and it's it kind of builds off that Harmon stream function pyramid that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So anyway, with that's all I had in terms of prepared content. And thank you all for your interest, and feel free to kind of ask any questions